There's something primal about the fear of falling. It lives deep in the bones, older than language, older than memory, and yet every now and then someone plunges from a height that should destroy them, and somehow, against everything we understand about gravity, they live. Tonight, settle in and get comfortable, because we're going to walk through some of the most extraordinary survival stories ever recorded. Stories of people who fell from the sky, from skyscrapers, and from the edges of waterfalls, and somehow woke up afterward. On the morning of January 26, 1972, a 22-year-old flight attendant named Vesna Vulovic was getting ready for what she thought would be a fairly routine workday. Vesna had only been working for JAT Yugoslav Airlines for about 8 months at that point, and she was still relatively new to the whole experience of flying professionally. She had grown up in Belgrade, Serbia, and had fallen in love with the idea of travel after a trip to London to study English. When a friend mentioned that she was becoming a flight attendant, Vesna saw her opportunity and jumped at it. There was just one small problem. Vesna had a history of low blood pressure, and she knew that it would likely disqualify her during the mandatory medical examination. So before her appointment, she drank several cups of coffee, hoping the caffeine would temporarily spike her blood pressure just enough to squeak past the threshold. And to her delight, it worked. She passed, she was accepted into the training program, and within a few months she was flying. But on that cold January day in 1972, fate had something waiting for Vesna that no amount of coffee could prepare her for. She wasn't even supposed to be working that particular flight. JT Flight 367 was a route from Stockholm to Belgrade with a scheduled stopover in Copenhagen, and according to Vesna herself, she had been mixed up with another flight attendant who shared her first name. The airline had confused the two Vesnas on the schedule, and rather than correct the mistake, Vesna Vulovic simply went along with it. She had never been to Denmark before and thought of it as an exciting little detour, another stamp in her growing mental passport of places she'd seen. When the secondary crew arrived in Copenhagen on the morning of January 25th, the day before the fateful flight, Vesna was eager to go sightseeing. But the rest of the crew seemed distracted, almost somber. They insisted on going shopping instead, buying gifts for their families, and Vesna noticed something strange about the mood on board. The captain, she would later recall, locked himself in his hotel room for a full 24 hours and didn't come out at all. During breakfast the next morning, the co-pilot talked about his son and daughter in a way that seemed oddly final, as though no one else in the world had children of their own. Vesna didn't know what to make of it at the time, but looking back, she would say that her colleagues seemed to sense something, almost as though they knew they would die. At 1:30 in the afternoon on January 26th, the crew met the incoming Flight 367 at Copenhagen Airport and watched the previous passengers and crew deplane. New passengers boarded, and at 3:15 in the afternoon, the aircraft, a McDonnell Douglas DC-9, pushed back from the gate and climbed into the gray European sky. For about 46 minutes, everything was normal. The plane reached its cruising altitude of roughly 33,000 feet as it passed over what was then Czechoslovakia. Vesna went about her duties in the cabin, greeting passengers, moving through the aisle. She would later say that the last thing she remembers clearly is standing near the rear of the cabin and seeing a few women cleaning up. After that, her memory goes blank. At 4:01 in the afternoon, a bomb detonated in the aircraft's baggage compartment. The explosion, later attributed to a briefcase bomb believed to have been planted by Croatian nationalists, tore through the belly of the DC-9 and caused the fuselage to break apart in midair. The plane fractured into 3 major sections high above the Czechoslovak village of Srbska Kamenice, and 27 of the 28 people on board, passengers and crew alike, were either blown out of the aircraft by the depressurization or fell to their deaths as the wreckage tumbled earthward. Everyone on board died, everyone except Vesna. When the cabin depressurized, the sudden rush of air blew most of the passengers and crew out of the aircraft at altitude, sending them tumbling through the freezing atmosphere with nothing to slow them down. But Vesna, by some extraordinary twist of physics and luck, was pinned in place by a food trolley that wedged against her spine and trapped her inside a section of the fuselage. That section of the aircraft, the midsection where she was found, separated from the rest and fell like a massive, ungainly leaf toward the forested mountains below. The wreckage came down in a densely wooded area, and the thick canopy of trees, combined with a heavy blanket of winter snow on the ground, helped absorb some of the catastrophic force of the impact. It was still a fall from 33,000 feet, over 6 miles straight down, a height so extreme that the air is too thin to breathe and the temperature plunges well below freezing. And yet the combination of the fuselage wrapping around her, the food cart pinning her in place, the trees slowing the descent of the wreckage, and the deep snow cushioning the final impact all came together in a sequence of events so improbable that it defies easy explanation. A local villager named Bruno Honke was the first person to reach the crash site. Honke had been a medic during the Second World War, and when he heard screaming coming from the twisted remains of the aircraft, he rushed toward the sound. He found Vesna partially inside the wreckage, her body battered and broken, but somehow, unbelievably, still alive. Her turquoise flight attendant uniform was soaked in blood. Her stiletto heels had been ripped from her feet by the force of the impact. But she was breathing, and she was conscious enough to cry out for help. Honke used his wartime medical knowledge to stabilize Vesna as best he could until proper rescue teams arrived, and she was transported to a hospital in Prague. When she arrived, her injuries were staggering. She had a fractured skull, a hemorrhaging brain, 2 crushed vertebrae, a broken pelvis, both legs broken, several broken ribs, and she was temporarily paralyzed from the waist down. She slipped into a coma that would last for 27 days, and doctors weren't sure she would ever wake up. But she did. And the first thing she asked for when she opened her eyes and saw her parents in the hospital room was a cigarette. From the hour she regained consciousness, she surprised everyone around her. Doctors had expected, at best, permanent paralysis. Instead, within 10 months of her fall, Vesna Vulovic was walking again. She attributed her recovery to what she jokingly called a childhood diet of chocolate, spinach, and fish oil. Doctors, meanwhile, speculated that the same low blood pressure that nearly kept her from becoming a flight attendant in the first place may have actually saved her life. They theorized that her heart should have burst upon impact, but her naturally low blood pressure reduced the strain on her cardiovascular system, just enough to keep it intact. In 1985, Vesna was officially recognized by Guinness World Records for surviving the highest fall without a parachute, a record that still stands today. The certificate was presented to her at a gala in London by none other than Paul McCartney, which for Vesna, who had grown up listening to the Beatles in Yugoslavia, was an especially meaningful moment. But the aftermath of her survival was far from simple. Vesna carried survivor's guilt for the rest of her life. She told reporters that whenever she thought about the crash, she was overwhelmed by a feeling of guilt for having survived when 27 others did not. She sometimes wondered aloud whether she should have survived at all. She declined therapy and instead turned to religion, becoming a devout Orthodox Christian. Despite the trauma, she said her ordeal had made her an optimist. She once told an interviewer that if you could survive what she survived, you could survive anything. In the years that followed, Vesna also became known for her political courage. In the early 1990s, as Serbia descended into the chaos of the Yugoslav wars, she spoke out publicly against the authoritarian regime of Slobodan Milosevic and participated in anti-government protests. As a result, she was reportedly either fired from JAT or demoted and forced into early retirement with a poor pension. Pro-government tabloids launched a smear campaign against her, and there were even attempts to discredit her survival story by claiming the plane had actually been shot down at a much lower altitude. But Vesna dismissed these conspiracy theories and continued to live her life with quiet resilience. She passed away in Belgrade on December 23, 2016, at the age of 66, leaving behind a legacy that continues to astonish anyone who hears it. And what makes Vesna's story even more haunting is that for decades afterward, questions lingered about what really happened aboard Flight 367. In 2009, two investigative journalists based in Prague claimed that the aircraft had been mistakenly shot down by the Czechoslovak Air Force at a much lower altitude of only about 2,600 feet, and that the record-setting fall was part of a government cover-up. However, flight data from the aircraft's black boxes, analyzed by specialists from Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia, and the Netherlands, confirmed that the plane had indeed been at its stated cruising altitude of 33,000 feet when the explosion occurred. The Civilian Aviation Authority and Czech military experts dismissed the conspiracy theory, and Guinness World Records confirmed that Vesna's record stands. Now, Vesna's fall is the highest ever survived without a parachute, but she was hardly the first person to cheat death by surviving a seemingly impossible plunge from the sky. In fact, 3 decades before her ordeal, during the bloodiest conflict in human history, a Soviet airman named Ivan Chisov found himself in a terrifyingly similar situation, though his fall happened not because of a terrorist bomb, but because of a dogfight over the frozen Eastern Front. It was January of 1942, and the Second World War was grinding through one of its darkest chapters on the Eastern Front. The Soviet Union was locked in a desperate struggle against Nazi Germany, and the skies over the battlefield were as dangerous as the trenches below. Lieutenant Ivan Mikhailovich Chisov was a 26-year-old navigator serving aboard an Ilyushin Il-4 medium bomber, a twin-engine workhorse of the Soviet Air Force that was used for strategic bombing runs against German supply lines and positions. By this point in the war, Chisov had already completed dozens of combat missions, specializing in the kind of low-altitude precision strikes that required nerves of steel and pinpoint accuracy. On this particular January day, Chisov's bomber was flying a mission somewhere over the Eastern Front when his formation was suddenly set upon by a swarm of German Luftwaffe fighters, possibly as many as 12 Messerschmitt Bf-109S. These were the backbone of the German fighter force, fast and lethal, and they tore into the Soviet bombers with cannon and machine gun fire. Chisov's aircraft took catastrophic damage almost immediately. The engines were hit, fires broke out, and the structural integrity of the bomber began to fail. The crew had no choice but to abandon the aircraft. Chisov bailed out at an estimated altitude of around 23,000 feet, roughly 4.5 miles above the frozen earth below. He was wearing a parachute and had every intention of using it. But there was a problem. The air battle was still raging all around him. German fighters were everywhere, and Chisov knew from hard experience that a man dangling from a parachute in the middle of a dogfight was little more than a slow-moving target. Pilots on both sides had been known to strafe helpless parachutists, and Chisov wasn't about to make himself an easy kill. So he made a calculated decision. He would free fall through the battle, drop below the altitude where the fighters were operating, and then deploy his chute once he was safely out of sight. It was risky, but it was better than floating through a hail of gunfire. The plan might have worked perfectly if not for one critical factor that Chisov failed to account for. At 23,000 feet, the atmosphere is painfully thin. There simply isn't enough oxygen to sustain consciousness for very long without supplemental breathing equipment, and as Chisov fell, the lack of oxygen crept up on him faster than he expected. Before he could reach for the ripcord, his vision narrowed, his thoughts scattered, and he blacked out entirely. He was now falling unconscious, at terminal velocity, with an unopened parachute strapped to his back, and nothing between him and the frozen ground but 4 miles of empty, indifferent air. What happened next should have been the end of his story. Chisov struck the edge of a snow-covered ravine at an estimated speed of somewhere between 120 and 150 miles per hour. But the angle of impact and the deep blanket of winter snow conspired in his favor. Rather than slamming flat into solid ground, he hit the steep slope of the ravine at an oblique angle, and his body bounced, slid, rolled, and plowed its way down to the bottom, the snow absorbing more and more energy with each tumble. The aerial battle overhead had been observed by a Soviet cavalry unit commanded by General Pavel Belov, and when the cavalrymen saw a body plummet from the sky and hit the ground, several of them galloped to the impact site, fully expecting to recover a corpse. Instead, to their astonishment, they found Ivan Chisov alive. He was badly hurt, still unconscious, and still wearing his unopened parachute, but he was breathing. Chisov was rushed into emergency surgery and operated on by a surgeon named Gudinsky. His injuries were severe, including multiple spinal fractures, a broken pelvis, and a broken leg. For a full month after the surgery, his condition was listed as critical, and it was uncertain whether he would survive. But survive he did, and against all medical expectations, he was back on his feet within 3 months. He even requested to return to active combat flying, though his superiors, perhaps wisely, denied the request and instead assigned him to train new bomber navigators for the remainder of the war. All told, Ivan Chisov flew over 70 combat missions during his military career. After the war, he graduated from the Military Political Academy and went on to serve as a political officer in the Soviet Army. He retired with the rank of lieutenant colonel and lived until 1986, dying at the age of 70, more than 4 decades after the fall that should have killed him. Almost exactly 1 year after Chisov's miracle in the snow, another airman on the other side of the world found himself in a remarkably similar predicament, falling from the sky without a working parachute. But this time, the landing wouldn't be cushioned by snow. This time, the man would crash through a glass roof. On January 3, 1943, Staff Sergeant Alan Eugene McGee was climbing into the ball turret of a B-17 Flying Fortress, nicknamed Snap, Crackle, Pop, for a daylight bombing run over the western French port city of Saint-Nazaire. The name of the aircraft came from its pilot, Captain Jacob Fredericks, who had worked as an engineer for the Kellogg Cereal Company before the war. It was a lighthearted name for a machine about to fly into one of the most dangerous missions of the air war. Alan McGee had been born in Plainfield, New Jersey, the youngest of 6 children. After the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, he had immediately enlisted in the United States Army Air Forces, driven by the same surge of patriotism that sent millions of young Americans to recruiting offices across the country. He had applied to be a pilot but was passed over. Instead, his short stature, standing just 5 feet 7 inches and weighing about 150 pounds, made him a perfect fit for the claustrophobic confines of the B-17's ball turret, a tiny plexiglass and metal sphere that hung from the belly of the bomber and housed 2 .50 caliber machine guns. The turret was so small that there was no room to wear a parachute inside it. The gunner would leave his chute on the deck of the aircraft above and climb down into the turret without it, trusting that if things went wrong, he would have time to climb back up and strap it on. This was McGee's 7th mission, and his target was a fortified German submarine port that bomber crews had grimly nicknamed Flak City because of the staggering volume of anti-aircraft fire that greeted every Allied formation that dared to approach it. There were 85 B-17s in the formation that day, along with fighter escorts, and as they neared Saint-Nazaire, the sky erupted into a storm of shrapnel and smoke. German anti-aircraft batteries, or flak guns, hurled clouds of steel into the air, shredding metal and flesh with indiscriminate fury. McGee's ball turret was hit early in the attack, and the damage rendered it inoperable. Wounded and bleeding from shrapnel wounds, he clambered up out of the turret and back into the fuselage of the aircraft, reaching for his parachute. But when he found it, his heart sank. The parachute pack had been shredded by the same flak that disabled his turret. The silk canopy was torn apart, the lines severed. It was useless. Before McGee could figure out his next move, another direct hit from the German batteries blew off a section of the bomber's right wing. The aircraft immediately lost its aerodynamic balance and entered a violent, uncontrollable spin. The centrifugal force of the spiraling bomber was enormous, and McGee, already weakened by his wounds and starved of oxygen at 22,000 feet, was thrown out of the aircraft through an opening in the fuselage. He was now falling through the sky, 4 miles above the earth, without a parachute. He was wounded, bleeding, and losing consciousness rapidly from the thin air. He woke briefly during the fall, aware that he was tumbling through open space, and he prayed. Then the lack of oxygen took him again, and everything went dark. What happened next is almost impossible to believe. McGee's body plummeted more than 22,000 feet and crashed through the glass roof of the Saint-Nazaire railway station. The slope of the roof and the shattering glass somehow absorbed enough of the impact energy to prevent instant death. Instead of smashing into solid ground at terminal velocity, McGee broke through the glass and came to rest on the steel girders of the station's interior framework. When German soldiers found him in the wreckage of the shattered glass roof, he was alive but barely. His injuries were catastrophic. He had 28 separate shrapnel wounds from the flak attack, a broken nose, severe damage to both eyes, a punctured lung, kidney damage, multiple broken bones, and his right arm was nearly severed completely. He was taken to a German field hospital where a military surgeon, whose name McGee never learned, worked to save his life. The doctor reportedly told McGee that while they were enemies, he was a doctor first and would do everything in his power to save his arm. And he did. The surgery was successful, and McGee's arm was repaired. When McGee regained consciousness as the Germans were carrying him to the hospital, his first words were simply, "Thank God, I am alive." The German soldiers who captured him reportedly treated him with a kind of stunned respect. There was something about a man who had fallen from 4 miles up and lived that commanded a certain reverence, even from the enemy. McGee spent the rest of the war as a prisoner of war, held at Stalag 17B in Austria until the camp was liberated in May of 1945. He was awarded the Air Medal for meritorious service and the Purple Heart for his injuries. And in one of those beautifully stubborn twists of character, the man who fell 4 miles without a parachute went on to earn his pilot's license after the war and spent 3 decades working in the commercial aviation industry. Decades later, in 1993, McGee and his wife Helen returned to Saint-Nazaire for the dedication of a memorial to him and his 7 crewmates who died when snap, crackle, pop crashed into the nearby forest. During that visit, McGee walked through the rebuilt railway station and looked up at the glass roof, the same roof that had saved his life half a century earlier. His only comment, delivered with the dry understatement of a man who had stared death in the face and won, was that he remembered it being much smaller. He passed away in San Angelo, Texas, on December 20th, 2003, at the age of 84. And remarkably, just over a year after McGee's fall, yet another World War II airman would find himself in the same horrifying position, falling from the sky without a working parachute, choosing between fire and gravity, and somehow living to tell about it. On the night of March 24th, 1944, 21-year-old Flight Sergeant Nicholas Alcamaide was sitting in the rear turret of an Avro Lancaster heavy bomber nicknamed Werewolf. Alcamaide had been born in North Walsham, Norfolk, and before the war he had worked a quiet life as a market gardener in Loughborough. But the war had a way of pulling quiet men into extraordinary circumstances, and by March 1944, Alcamaide was a rear gunner with No. 115 Squadron of the Royal Air Force, flying night bombing missions over Nazi Germany. The Lancaster was one of the most formidable bombers of the war, capable of carrying enormous bomb loads deep into enemy territory. But for all its power, the aircraft had a well-known vulnerability at the rear. The tail gunner's position was isolated, cramped, and brutally cold. The turret was so tight that there was no room for the gunner to wear his parachute while operating the 4 Browning machine guns. Instead, like the ball turret gunners on American B-17S, the rear gunner stored his parachute pack just inside the fuselage, behind the doors of the turret, ready to be clipped onto a harness if the order came to bail out. That night, Alcamaide and the 6 other crew members of Werewolf were returning from a 300-bomber raid on Berlin. The mission itself had gone according to plan, but on the long flight home, things began to go wrong. Strong northern winds had pushed the formation further south than intended, carrying them over the heavily defended industrial heartland of Germany's Ruhr Valley. And it was there, just before midnight, that a German Junkers Ju-88 night fighter, flown by a pilot named Oberleutnant Heinz Rocker, found them. Rocker attacked from below, raking Werewolf's starboard wing and fuselage with cannon and machine gun fire. The rounds tore through the aircraft's skin and ignited a fire that spread with terrifying speed. Within seconds, flames were streaming back along the fuselage, past Alcamaide's turret, and the plexiglass enclosure around his position had been completely shattered by the attack, exposing him to the freezing night air rushing past at hundreds of miles per hour. The pilot, James Newman, gave the order to bail out. Alchemade rotated his turret to face the fuselage, opened the doors, and reached for his parachute. But what he found stopped him cold. The parachute pack was engulfed in flames. The entire interior of the fuselage behind his turret was a roaring inferno. There was no way to reach the chute, and even if he could, it was already burning. The silk canopy would have been destroyed. Alchemade now faced a choice that no human being should ever have to make. He could stay in the turret and burn to death as the aircraft spiraled toward the ground, or he could jump without a parachute and fall 18,000 feet to the earth below, dying on impact but sparing himself the agony of the fire. For Alchemade, the decision was clear. A quick death was preferable to a slow one. He later said that his final thought before jumping was simply that at least it would be quick. He turned his turret to face outward, away from the burning fuselage, and tumbled backward out of the aircraft into the night sky. He was 18,000 feet up, roughly 3.5 miles above the ground. The air was viciously cold, and the stars above were clear and bright. He would later describe the sensation of falling not as terrifying, but almost peaceful. He didn't feel like he was plunging. He felt suspended, motionless, as though the sky itself were holding him in place. He could see the burning werewolf above him, getting smaller, and the glow of the fire reflected off the clouds. He estimated that he was conscious for about 45 seconds of the fall, enough time to think about home and feel a pang of regret that he wouldn't make it back. Then the cold and the thin air took their toll, and he blacked out. 3 hours later, Nicholas Alchemade opened his eyes. He was lying on his back in deep snow in a small pine forest. Above him, framed by the branches of the trees, was a ragged hole in the canopy. The same hole his body had punched through when it came crashing down from the sky. The stars were still out, calm and indifferent, as though nothing had happened. He moved his arms. They worked. He moved his legs. They worked too. He sat up carefully and felt his body for damage. His flight suit was charred from the fire. He had burns on his face and hands. There were cuts on his head and thigh from the shattered plexiglass. And his knee was twisted and sore. But that was it. Not a single bone was broken. After falling 18,000 feet without a parachute, Nicholas Alchemade's worst injury from the fall itself was a sprained knee. What saved him was a perfect sequence of natural cushioning. The young, flexible pine trees bent under his weight as he crashed through them, each branch absorbing a fraction of his velocity. And at the base of the trees, a thick blanket of soft snow, roughly 18 inches deep, was waiting to catch what was left of his momentum. Together, the trees and the snow transformed a certain death into something almost gentle. His flying boots had been ripped from his feet during the fall, probably torn away as his unconscious body struck the tree branches. He discarded his now useless parachute harness, fished a cigarette from the pack in his flight suit, and lit it. He sat there in the snow, smoking in the silence of the German forest at 3 a.m, very much alive. By dawn, German soldiers found him and took him to a local infirmary. He then was visited by the Gestapo, who interrogated him thoroughly. When Alchemade told them he had jumped from a burning aircraft at 18,000 feet without a parachute, they didn't believe him. They were convinced he was a spy who had parachuted in and buried his chute somewhere. Alchemade insisted they search the crash site, and they would find his parachute still in the wreckage. The Germans sent men to investigate, and sure enough, the charred remains of his parachute pack were found exactly where he said they would be, still inside the burnt skeleton of Werewolf. The Germans were stunned. They gave Alcamaid a signed certificate attesting to the truth of his incredible story, and he became something of a celebrity among the Luftwaffe officers who came to hear his tale. But celebrity status didn't earn him any special treatment. He was sent to the infamous Stalag Luft, 3 prisoner of war camp, where he joined thousands of other captured Allied airmen. And even there, Alcamaid's extraordinary luck held. When the camp's inmates were forced to march hundreds of miles across northern Germany in brutal winter conditions during the final months of the war, temperatures dropping to 22 below zero, Alcamaid survived that too. He was eventually liberated and returned to England, where he spent the rest of his life working in the chemical industry. He passed away in Cornwall in 1987 at the age of 64. Now, these wartime stories of airmen falling from miles above the earth share certain common threads: the cold, thin air of extreme altitude, the violent chaos of combat, and the desperate choices made in seconds that determine whether a person lives or dies. But survival from extreme heights isn't limited to wartime. Sometimes the fall comes out of nowhere on an ordinary day during what should be an ordinary flight, and the person who survives is not a trained soldier, but a teenager on her way home for Christmas. On Christmas Eve, 1971, 17-year-old Juliane Köpke and her mother Maria boarded Lanza Flight 508 in Lima, Peru. They were heading to the city of Pucallpa in the Amazon basin, where Juliane's father, Hans Wilhelm, was working at a remote biological research station called Panguana. Both of Juliane's parents were German zoologists who had dedicated their careers to studying the wildlife of the Peruvian rainforest, and Juliane had grown up splitting her time between the urban bustle of Lima and the dense, humid world of the jungle. She had graduated from high school just the day before, on December 23rd, and the trip to Pucallpa was supposed to be a joyful reunion, a family Christmas in the forest. The Köpkes had originally planned to fly out a few days earlier, but Juliane wanted to attend her graduation ceremony, and her mother agreed to wait. When they went to book a new flight, nearly everything was sold out for the holiday rush. The only available seats were on Lanza, a Peruvian airline with a notoriously poor safety record. Juliane's father had explicitly warned his wife against flying with Lanza, and he had good reason to be worried. The airline had already lost 2 aircraft in previous crashes, and its maintenance and safety practices were widely criticized. But there were no other options, and Maria and Juliane both desperately wanted to be home for Christmas. So they booked the flight. Lanza Flight 508 was a Lockheed L-188 Electra turboprop carrying 92 people, 86 passengers, and 6 crew members. Juliane and her mother were seated together, Juliane in the window seat, 19F, her favorite spot. The first half hour of the flight was smooth and unremarkable. The passengers received snacks, the engines hummed, and the green canopy of the Amazon stretched out below them like an endless carpet. And then, about 25 minutes before they were scheduled to land, the sky turned dark. The aircraft flew into a massive thunderstorm, and within seconds, the cabin was engulfed in turbulence so violent that baggage began popping out of the overhead compartments. Lightning flashed through the windows, illuminating the terrified faces of the passengers. People began screaming and crying. Juliane looked at her mother, who was sitting beside her, and Maria said quietly, almost calmly, "That is the end. It's all over." Those were the last words Juliane ever heard from her mother. A bolt of lightning struck the aircraft's right engine, and the wing caught fire. The structural damage cascaded rapidly, and the aircraft began to break apart in midair at an altitude of roughly 21,000 feet. The fuselage disintegrated, and Julianne found herself suddenly no longer inside an airplane. She was outside, in the open air, still strapped to her seat, which was still attached to the 2 empty seats beside her in a row of 3. Her mother was gone. Julianne was falling. She would later describe seeing the treetops of the Amazon rushing up toward her, and she said they looked like heads of broccoli. The 3-seat row she was strapped to was spinning as it fell, rotating like a helicopter blade, and this rotation may have been one of the factors that slowed her descent just enough to survive. The updrafts from the thunderstorm that destroyed the aircraft may have also played a role, creating pockets of resistance in the air that further reduced her speed. And at the bottom, the dense, multi-layered canopy of the Amazon rainforest was waiting, hundreds of feet of branches, vines, and leaves that bent and broke as her seat crashed through them, each layer absorbing a little more of the energy. At some point during the fall, Julianne lost consciousness. She woke up the next morning, still strapped to her seat, on the floor of the jungle. It was around 9 o'clock, and rain was falling. Her watch was still working. She had a broken collarbone, a deep gash on her right arm, a swollen and injured eye, a torn ligament in her knee, and a concussion. But she was alive, and she could move. What followed was an 11-day ordeal that would test every ounce of survival knowledge Julianne had absorbed from her years living in the jungle with her parents. She was alone, injured, disoriented, and had no food except for a bag of hard candy she found in the wreckage. The jungle was thick, hot, humid, and teeming with dangers. Insects swarmed her wounds, and within days, maggots had burrowed into the gash on her arm. She recalled her father once using gasoline to treat a dog infested with parasites, and she filed this memory away, hoping she might find a way to use it. Julianne remembered a piece of advice her father had given her long ago. If you're lost in the jungle, find water and follow it downstream. Water always leads to people. So she found a small stream and began to walk. She waded through the shallow water, step by painful step, for days. Sometimes the stream opened up into wider channels, and she would encounter deeper water where she feared caimans and piranhas, but she pressed on. At one point during her trek, she stumbled upon other rows of seats from the aircraft, and in some of them she found bodies, passengers who had survived the fall but died waiting for rescue that never came. As many as 14 other passengers may have initially survived the crash, but perished in the following days before anyone found them, including, it would later be learned, Julianne's own mother. After 9 days of walking through the jungle, Julianne came across a canoe tied to a riverbank, and nearby, a small shelter with a palm leaf roof. It was a camp used by local lumberjacks. She was exhausted. Her arm was infected and crawling with maggots, and she had lost a significant amount of weight. She found a container of gasoline near the shelter, and remembering her father's trick, poured it over her arm. She counted 35 maggots as they wriggled out of her flesh. The next day, the lumberjacks returned to their camp and found her. They were shocked, but they tended to her injuries as best they could, and the following day took her by canoe on a 7-hour journey to a small missionary settlement where she received proper medical attention. From there, she was eventually flown to Pucallpa, where her father was waiting. Julianne Kopka was the sole survivor of Lanza Flight 508. 91 other people perished. In the aftermath, the airline lost its operating certificate and never flew again. Julianne, meanwhile, carried the weight of her survival for the rest of her life. She developed a fear of flying, had nightmares for years, and was haunted by the loss of her mother and the question of why she alone had lived. She eventually returned to academia, earned a doctorate in biology, and followed in her parents' footsteps as a researcher. She married and became known by her married name, Julianne Diller. In 1998, she returned to the crash site for a documentary directed by Werner Herzog, who had a personal connection to the tragedy. Herzog had been scheduled to take that exact same Lanza flight while scouting locations for one of his films, but a last-minute change in plans saved his life. He had wanted to tell Julianne's story for decades, but couldn't find her because she had spent years avoiding the media. The experience of revisiting the crash site, she said, was a kind of therapy, the first time she was truly able to confront what had happened from a distance. And sometimes, the fall doesn't come from miles above the earth. Sometimes it comes from much closer, from a height that seems almost manageable until you understand the raw, unforgiving power of what's waiting at the bottom. Sometimes the fall is only 167 feet, but those 167 feet belong to Niagara Falls. On the afternoon of July 9th, 1960, a sunny summer Saturday in upstate New York, 7-year-old Roger Woodward and his 17-year-old sister Deanne were getting ready for a boat ride. Their family friend, a 40-year-old contractor from North Carolina named James Honeycutt, had offered to take the kids out on the upper Niagara River in his 12-foot aluminum fishing boat, powered by a modest 7.5 horsepower outboard motor. It was supposed to be nothing more than a casual afternoon on the water, a simple way to beat the summer heat. The Woodward family had recently moved to the Niagara Falls area, and an outing on the river seemed like a perfectly normal thing to do. Roger's parents made one stipulation before letting the kids go. Roger had to wear a life jacket. It was a small, orange life jacket, the kind you'd find in any sporting goods store, and Roger put it on without protest. It would turn out to be the single most important decision anyone made that day. The trio set off upstream, passing under Grand Island Bridge, the point that most experienced boaters considered the boundary of safe navigation on the upper river. Beyond that bridge, the current grew stronger and faster, building toward the immense volume of water that would eventually pour over the falls. Honeycutt, however, seemed unconcerned. He continued downstream, and then something went wrong. The boat struck a submerged rock, or a shoal, and the impact snapped a pin in the engine. The motor died. Without power, the little aluminum boat was instantly at the mercy of the Niagara River's current, which was now accelerating rapidly as they drifted closer to the falls. The boat began to spin. Water poured over the sides. Honeycutt tried to restart the engine, but it was hopeless. The boat capsized, and all three were thrown into the upper rapids. The water was moving at speeds of up to 40 miles per hour, and the force was overwhelming. Roger was separated from Honeycutt almost immediately. The current tossed the boy around like a rag doll, slamming him against rocks, pulling him under, and spitting him back to the surface. He was terrified, screaming, choking on water. People on the shore saw what was happening and ran along the banks, helpless to intervene. Deanne, meanwhile, was being swept toward the brink of the Horseshoe Falls on the American side. Hundreds of tourists stood at the guardrail, watching in horror as the teenage girl was carried closer and closer to the edge. Two men, both from New Jersey and strangers to each other, sprang into action. John Hayes, a truck driver and auxiliary police officer, climbed over the railing and stretched out onto an 18-inch ledge just above the water. He shouted to Deanne to kick harder, to swim toward him. His voice, she would later say, cut through her panic. She could hear him pleading, and his words made her swim harder. She reached out and caught his thumb just feet from the edge of the falls. But the current was so strong that Hayes couldn't pull her out alone. Another man, John Quattrochi, climbed over the railing to help, grabbed Deanne's other hand, and together the two men hauled her to safety. But there was no one to save Roger. The 7-year-old went over the brink of the Horseshoe Falls, 167 feet of thundering water, wearing nothing but a bathing suit and a small orange life jacket. James Honeycutt went over at the same time. Honeycutt was killed instantly. Roger would later describe the sensation of going over the falls not as a terrifying plunge, but as a strange, floating feeling. He said it didn't feel like a roller coaster or a free fall. It felt like floating, like vertigo, as though he couldn't tell which way was up and which way was down. Then he was underwater, buried in the churning white water at the base of the falls, tossed and tumbled in a washing machine of unimaginable force. By pure chance, one of the Maid of the Mist tour boats was making its regular turn at the base of the falls when a crew member spotted something bright in the water. It was Roger's orange life jacket. Captain Clifford Keach immediately maneuvered the boat toward the boy. The crew threw a life preserver, but the first toss missed. The second toss also fell short. On the third attempt, the ring landed close enough for Roger, who was crying and barely conscious, to reach it. The crew pulled him aboard. Roger Woodward was taken to Greater Niagara General Hospital, where he was diagnosed with a concussion and minor bruising. That was it. He had gone over Niagara Falls, one of the most powerful waterfalls on the planet, and emerged with little more than bumps and a headache. It was, and remains, one of the most remarkable survival stories in the history of the falls. Roger was the first person known to survive an unprotected plunge over the Horseshoe Falls, with nothing but a small life jacket between him and oblivion. The story made national headlines, and the press descended on the Woodward family. But Roger's parents wanted their children to have normal lives, and they resisted the spotlight. The family eventually moved away, and for 34 years, Roger and Deanne never spoke about the incident, not even to each other. It wasn't until the 1990s, when Roger was in his 30s, that he began to open up about what happened, calling the experience of sharing his story a kind of therapy. Now, in all of these stories so far, the survivors fell from the sky, from bridges, from waterfalls, carried by gravity through open air, until something at the bottom broke their fall just enough to keep them alive. But what about a fall where there is no snow, no trees, no water, no glass roof, nothing but concrete and steel? What happens when a person falls nearly 500 feet straight down onto the sidewalks of one of the most densely built cities on Earth? On the morning of December 7th, 2007, Alcides Moreno and his younger brother Edgar climbed onto a suspended window washing platform on the roof of the Solo Tower, a 47-story residential skyscraper on Manhattan's Upper East Side. The Moreno brothers were immigrants from Ecuador who had built their lives in the New York area. Alcides was 37 years old, a father of 3 children aged 14, 8, and 6, and he loved his job. He liked the views from up high, liked the satisfaction of seeing the glass gleam after he had cleaned it, and he wasn't afraid of heights. Edgar, his younger brother, worked alongside him. The 2 brothers strapped themselves onto the platform, gathered their equipment, and prepared for what should have been an ordinary day of work. But the cables holding the platform to the roof had not been properly secured, and without warning, the cables slipped from their attachment point. The left side of the platform dropped first, tilting violently, and Edgar was thrown from the platform almost immediately. Then the entire rig gave way, and both brothers began to fall. They fell 47 stories, nearly 500 feet. The equivalent of looking down from the top of a 47-story building and watching the ground rush toward you at lethal speed. Edgar Moreno was killed on impact. His body struck a wooden fence that severed him, and he died instantly. The death rate from a fall of just 3 stories is approximately 50%. People who fall more than 10 stories almost never survive. 47 stories is, in the words of the doctors who would later treat Alcides, virtually beyond belief. And yet, when paramedics reached the base of the solo tower, they found Alcides Moreno in a tangle of twisted metal, crouched on the remains of the platform, trying to stand up. He was still holding the controls of the platform in his hands. He was alive. How he survived remains a matter of some speculation. One widely held theory is that Alcides, unlike Edgar, stayed on the platform as it fell. The flat surface of the platform, tumbling through the air, may have generated enough wind resistance to slightly slow the descent, much like a very crude and very inefficient parachute. The platform may have also helped distribute the impact force across Alcides' body, rather than concentrating it in one area. Some emergency responders believe that his grip on the platform kept him in a position that, by sheer luck, distributed the trauma in a survivable way. Others simply shake their heads and call it a miracle. At the hospital, doctors described Alcides' condition as a complete disaster. He had broken both legs, his right arm and wrist, and had suffered devastating injuries to his chest, abdomen, and spinal column. Nearly every part of his body was bleeding. He underwent 10 surgeries in the weeks that followed. He spent 3 weeks on a ventilator, unable to breathe on his own, unable to speak, unable to do anything except reach out and touch his wife Rosario's face and hair when she sat beside his bed. And then, on Christmas Day, 18 days after his fall, Alcides Moreno opened his mouth and spoke. His first words since the accident were addressed to a nurse who was checking on him. His wife had been playfully scolding him for reaching out and touching the nurse's hand, and he responded in English, "What did I do?" Rosario was stunned. She hadn't known he could speak. Over the following months, Alcides' recovery astonished his medical team. He regained movement in all 4 limbs. He was able to breathe on his own. He underwent extensive physical rehabilitation, and while doctors cautioned that some of his injuries would be lifelong, they were optimistic about a substantial recovery. The chief of surgery at New York Presbyterian Hospital, Dr. Philip Berry, summed it up with a phrase that would be repeated in every news story about the case. "If you are a believer in miracles," he said, "this would be one." Years later, in a rare interview, Alcides said he wasn't sure why he survived. He had a new baby son, born after the accident, and he speculated that perhaps the reason he was spared was to raise that child and tell him his story. He said he could walk, though he couldn't run. He sometimes had trouble finishing sentences, and he carried the grief of losing his brother Edgar every single day. When asked if he considered himself a miracle, he said he didn't, because a miracle wouldn't have taken his brother. His wife, for her part, made one thing absolutely clear. His days as a window washer were over, and sometimes the fall doesn't come from a skyscraper or a mountaintop or the belly of a burning bomber. Sometimes it comes during what is supposed to be the thrill of a lifetime, a moment of pure adrenaline that goes catastrophically wrong in the span of a few heartbeats. On October 9, 2005, 21-year-old Shayna Richardson of Joplin, Missouri, was about to make her first solo skydiving jump. She had started skydiving a few months earlier, right around her 21st birthday, and had been building up her experience with tandem jumps and supervised dives. This was her 10th overall jump, but her first time going solo, and she was doing it at a skydiving facility in Siloam Springs, Arkansas. Everything about the jump started normally. Shayna exited the aircraft at altitude and entered freefall, feeling the familiar rush of wind and the sensation of weightlessness that draws people to the sport. When the time came, she deployed her main parachute, but something went horribly wrong. She heard a sharp snap, and instead of the gentle deceleration she expected, she began to spin. One of the toggles, the webbing loops attached to the brake lines that allow a skydiver to steer, had become unstowed during the opening, causing the canopy to pull hard to one side and send her into an uncontrolled spiral. Shayna tried to fix the problem, but couldn't. Following her training, she cut away the malfunctioning main chute so that her reserve parachute could deploy. The reserve fired, but it didn't open properly. Some of the lines became tangled, and the canopy never fully inflated. She was still spinning, still falling, and now she was out of options. From about 3,000 feet up, Shayna Richardson could see the ground rushing toward her. She had time to think. She had time to process what was about to happen, and what flashed through her mind was the understanding that she was going to die. She recalled later that she saw everything she had ever loved and everything she had ever dreamed of doing simply end. She prepared herself for impact. She hit face first in a paved parking lot at an estimated speed of 50 miles per hour. The impact shattered her face, broke her pelvis in 2 places, broke her leg, and knocked out 6 of her teeth. She lost consciousness on impact and remembered nothing of the landing itself. Rescuers rushed her to a hospital in Fayetteville, Arkansas, where she underwent the first of what would eventually be 4 major surgeries. 15 steel plates were implanted in her face to reconstruct the damage, and then, while doctors were treating her injuries, they discovered something no one expected. Shayna Richardson was 2 weeks pregnant. She hadn't known. The baby, no larger than a grain of rice at that point, had survived the freefall, the 50-mile-per-hour impact, with the pavement, the x-rays, the CAT scans, the MRIs, the anesthesia, and all 4 surgeries. Subsequent checkups showed the fetus was developing normally, with arms, legs, a full face, and a healthy heartbeat. Shayna's due date was set for June 25th of the following year. When Shayna appeared on national television to tell her story, she described the experience with a mixture of wonder and gratitude. She said there was no logical explanation for why she lived, and that it simply came down to something beyond her understanding. And remarkably, despite everything that had happened, she announced that she planned to go skydiving again. She said you had to go for yourself. Her baby boy was born healthy, and Shayna, covered in surgical scars and steel plates, moved on with her life, carrying with her one of the most improbable survival stories of the 21st century. Every one of these stories shares something in common, and it's not luck, although luck clearly played a role in each of them. What they share is the raw, stubborn resilience of the human body and the human spirit. Vesna Vulovic fell 6 miles and walked again within 10 months. Ivan Chisov hit the ground at 150 miles per hour and was flying missions 3 months later. Alan McGee crashed through a glass roof and spent 60 more years on this earth. Nicholas Alcamade sprained his knee. Julianne Kupka walked through the Amazon for 11 days with a broken collarbone and maggots in her arm. Roger Woodward went over Niagara Falls at age 7 and grew up to tell the story with grace and humility. Alcides Moreno fell 47 stories and held his wife's hand on Christmas Day. And Shayna Richardson hit a parking lot at 50 miles per hour and brought a healthy baby into the world. These stories remind us that the line between life and death is thinner than we think, and that sometimes, for reasons that science can explain and reasons it cannot, the fall doesn't end the way it's supposed to. Thank you so much for listening tonight. If you enjoyed this, I'd really appreciate it if you could hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It means more than you know, and it helps us keep making content just like this. Sweet dreams, and I'll see you in the next one.